Hi everybody and welcome to the Romance of Redemption Part 5. Before I get going today, we've had a few people ask about notes. Every single one of these talks that I'm giving has PDF notes where you get everything that I've got on those notes, and it's available on the same website where you're seeing this video. So just go to those notes and you've got everything there. I want you to think about Naomi and her walk of faith. In chapter 1, it started with her disobedience, and that chapter ended with her having no hope for the future. Having been reintroduced to Boaz through Ruth, we find in chapter 2 that she has renewed confidence in God and begins to hope for a better future. What does her journey of faith teach us about our own journey of faith with God? One day, Ruth's mother-in-law, Naomi, said to her, "My daughter, I must find a home for you where you will be well provided for. Now Boaz, with whose women you have worked, is a relative of ours. Tonight he will be winnowing barley on the threshing floor. Wash, put on perfume, and get dressed in your best clothes. Then go down to the threshing floor. But don't let him know you are there until he has finished eating and drinking. When he lies down, note the place where he is lying. Then go and uncover his feet and lie down. He will tell you what to do." "I will do whatever you say," Ruth answered. So she went down to the threshing floor and did everything her mother-in-law told her to do. When Boaz had finished eating and drinking and was in good spirits, he went over to lie down at the far end of the grain pile. Ruth approached quietly, uncovered his feet and lay down. In the middle of the night, something startled the man. He turned and there was a woman lying at his feet. "Who are you?" he asked. "I am your servant, Ruth," she said. "Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are a guardian redeemer of our family." "The Lord bless you, my daughter," he replied. "This kindness is greater than that which you showed earlier. You have not run after the younger men, whether rich or poor." Verse 1 starts with "one day" in the NIV, and some translations the word "then." We finished chapter 2 with the barley and the wheat harvests, and we saw in chapter 2 that Boaz worked every day of the harvest with his workers in the fields. So although it's barley that is being threshed here, we see this happens then, that is after the grain harvesting had been finished. And so now think about those time periods. In chapter 1, over 10 years whizzed past. Then most of chapter 2 is a single day. The last verse of chapter 2, over 3 months, whiz past again. And then here we have one day, that night, and the following day. "My daughter, I must find a home," the word is rest, "for you, where you will be well provided for." It's the same word as in chapter 1, verse 9. "May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband." In the context here, the rest that's being referred to is the rest that comes by security through marriage. I want you to notice that Naomi had 3 challenges. How could the name of Elimelech be maintained amongst the tribes of Israel, given that both her husband and their sons were dead? How could the family inheritance be protected? And how could she ensure Ruth's welfare? Now the second point needs a bit of clarification, because to this point we've seen that Ruth and Naomi are poor. But in verse 5 of chapter 4, we learn that Naomi has land. Well, how is she poor? If she's got land, surely she could sell the land and make money, or she could use the land and make money that way. The implication is that Elimelech and Naomi had leased out that land to somebody else before they left for Moab because of the famine. Remember, the land itself belonged to God, as we see in Leviticus 25. but the use of the land could be sold, or what we would call today, it could be leased out. Now, the person who bought that lease, they can, of course, sell it on to somebody else. But at any point in time, whether that person who's leased it or not, is selling it or not, at any point in time, a certain type of close relative, a goel, could redeem the land, as we see in Leviticus 25. And interestingly, that chapter goes on to show that that goel, that special type of relative, could redeem not only land, but other types of redemption were possible as well. For example, in Leviticus 25, 47 to 48, if any of your fellow Israelites become poor and sell themselves, that is, into slavery, they retain the right of redemption after they have sold themselves. One of their relatives may redeem them. Our kinsman redeemer redeemed us from the slavery of sin. Now, points 1 and 2 have one type of solution, but point 3, a different solution. Naomi would have known that Boaz was not her nearest kinsman redeemer. On the one hand, if Ruth married her nearest kinsman redeemer, that might solve point 1. But not necessarily, because remember, she was married to Mahlon for 10 years and they didn't have children. So simply by marrying the nearest kinsman redeemer, she may never have children. Maybe she's unable to have children. So point 1 isn't necessarily solved because she may not actually bear offspring. Point 2 would be solved because Naomi would then have the right to use that land. But it would not necessarily solve point 3. She knew, that is, Naomi knew that Boaz would be a good husband to Ruth. But clearly the actions that she takes in this chapter indicate that she wasn't confident that this other man would be a good husband for Ruth. On the other hand, Naomi had witnessed the growing relationship between Ruth and Boaz over the past 3 months. A marriage to Boaz would solve point 3, but not necessarily points 1 and 2, unless that nearer kinsman redeemer relinquished his right of redemption. 2 laws come together at this point. There is the law of redemption, which we see in Leviticus 25, whereby a close relative, a goel, can redeem land on behalf of another close relative. And from Deuteronomy 25, the law of Levirate marriage, which dealt with the situation of a childless widow. She could go to the next of kin and put a claim on him to take her as his wife to raise up children for the family of the deceased. By instructing Ruth, as she did, we see that Naomi's primary focus was Ruth's welfare. Naomi never raises the issue of getting an heir for her deceased husband. Had that been her intention, she would have looked for an opportunity involving the nearer kinsman, not Boaz. Instead, we see here again that she is a loving mother towards Ruth. And as we saw in Genesis 24, where Abraham took charge of finding a marriage partner for his son, we see the Jewish custom is a good parent would find the marriage partner for their child. So here we see she is a loving mother and she's doing what a good Jewish parent would do. She's looking for a marriage partner for Ruth who will make Ruth happy. Over the past 3 months, Naomi had put a plan together and she acted when she saw the opportunity. In chapter 2, verse 22 to 23, we see that she coached Ruth in culturally appropriate behaviour. Now, over 3 months have gone past, and presumably over this time, she has continued to coach Ruth in culturally appropriate behaviour. And here again, we see her doing that. Naomi's plan meant that she would have to renounce her own claim to her kinsman redeemer and give it to Ruth, the younger widow. Her love for Ruth was evident in her unselfish action. She knew that if Ruth remained an unprotected widow in Israel, she would have a very hard life. Naomi took the initiative when the opportunity presented itself. But, getting back to my question at the start of today's session, was she acting according to God's will, or was she simply doing what we saw in chapter 1, doing what was right in her own eyes, as was so common in the time of the judges? How is what Naomi does here different from what she did in chapter 1? In Ruth chapter 1, she went in the opposite direction to what God had said to do, and her sons married women whom God said not to marry. She knew that her choices were contrary to what God had already said. But here in Ruth chapter 3, the situation is different. Isaiah 30 and verse 21 demonstrates this. Your ears shall hear a word behind you saying, this is the way, walk in it, whenever you turn to the right hand or whenever you turn to the left. The Living Bible puts it in simpler language. And if you leave God's paths and go astray, you will hear a voice behind you say, no, this is the way, walk here. If we know God has said not to do something and we do it anyway, as Naomi did in chapter 1, that's clearly disobedience and not an act of faith. But if we do not know God's view, and if we have not heard his voice telling us to go another way, then, as Naomi does here, we go forward with faith, trusting that if we follow the wrong path, God will correct us. We're not told exactly how Naomi knew that tonight was the night for action. The critical moment had arrived. But she knew what she was doing. The plan that Naomi proposed was full of risk and danger. Ruth would expose herself to the possibility of humiliation and, worse, rape. But Naomi knew the character of Boaz and rested the whole scheme on what she knew about his honour and integrity. Verses 2 and verse 7. Tonight he will be winnowing barley on the threshing floor. He went over to lie down at the far end of the grain pile. If we can have that picture up, please. When the winnowing was done, the farmer normally stayed with the grain at night, camping out on the threshing floor and to ensure that the harvest was not stolen, as we see an example of that stealing in 1 Samuel. Winnowing consisted of throwing a mixture of straw, chaff and grain into the wind by means of a fork with large teeth. The worthless chaff was blown away from the winnower, the straw less far, while the valuable, heavier kernels of grain fell back onto the threshing floor. The separation is the result of a breeze that usually blows off the Mediterranean from about 4 to 5 p.m. through to sunset. The wind, however, must not be too strong, for then even the heavier, valuable portions of grain would be blown away. In summer, the west wind blows very strongly in the afternoon, but drops off in the evening, so that the evening hours provide the most desirable wind conditions. To best take advantage of this natural phenomenon, the threshing floors were usually on elevated parcels of ground with hard-packed surface. In threshing, the grain was beaten out from the stalks with flails. We saw an example of that in the previous session where a woman was beating it out, as Ruth would have done with that ephah that she got in chapter 2. Here we see the more common approach, and that was that it would be trodden over by oxen. So as we see in the picture here, and you can see the stones that ringed the threshing floor, that was very common because that would contain the grain, the very valuable grain, in that area. The grain was then removed from the threshing floor and placed in heaps to be sold or stored in granaries. And threshing and winnowing were usually a time of great festivity and rejoicing. So you can see all of that here. The oxen trampling the fork to throw it all into the air so that it would be blown appropriately, the piles that were produced where the farmer would sleep at night to protect it, and it'd be up on a hill where the wind could be taken advantage of. Wash, put on perfume, and get dressed in your best clothes. Ruth prepared herself before going to the Lord of Harvest, the kinsman redeemer. We see similar preparation from Joseph before he goes to Pharaoh, and from Esther before she goes to the emperor, the King of Kings. Why did Naomi encourage Ruth to do this at night, rather than in the daytime and in a public space? This reference to putting on appropriate clothing suggests that Ruth had been wearing mourning clothes up until this time, because her brother-in-law and her husband had recently died. This would explain why Boaz had not acted on his love for her. The kind of clothes that Ruth was probably wearing indicated to everyone that she was still mourning the loss of her husband. Boaz would have respected that and not pursued anything while she was still in mourning. Naomi tells Ruth, now is the time to change those clothes. Uncover his feet and lie down. Spread the corner of your garment over me. Embroidered on the hem of a person's garment was their rank. These days we see that with military personnel who on their collars have their rank identifying their level of authority. The hem was the border or fringe or bottom edge of the garment. We see this with Levitical garments that identify them as Levites in Exodus 28. We see another picture of this in 1 Samuel 24, where David goes into a cave where Saul is sleeping and cuts off the hem of Saul's garment. Now, in ancient Mesopotamia, which is that whole region, these days it's from Kuwait to southern Turkey, so it includes all of that region, and ancient Mesopotamia was from about 3000 BC to about 500 BC, so this was the period during which the story of Ruth took place. In ancient Mesopotamia, to cut off the hem was to strip a person of their authority. God's covenant with Israel is expressed as, I spread the corner of my garment over you, in Ezekiel 16. This is the only verse in the Bible where this expression is used of lovers. Here, God is describing Israel as the young woman whom he took for his wife. Isn't that so similar to Ruth and to Revelation chapter 5? It meant that God spread his authority and protection over the nation. In Matthew 14, people brought all their sick to him and begged him to let the sick just touch what? The edge of his cloak. And all who touched it were healed. In Luke 8, a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years, but no one could heal her. She came up behind him and touched the edge of his cloak, and immediately her bleeding stopped. Ruth boldly yet humbly sought her rights. The word for garment here is singular. We see it, or we saw it, in its plural form in chapter 2, verse 12, for the wings of God, again drawing our attention to Boaz as symbolic of our Redeemer. In chapter 2, we saw that Ruth could have demanded her right to glean, but chose the path of humility instead. Here, similarly, she could have gone out in public and demanded her right to be taken as the wife of the kinsman redeemer. She did, in this act, go to claim that right, expecting Boaz to marry her and to raise up a family to perpetuate the name of Elimelech. But Naomi wisely counselled Ruth not to come to Boaz as a victim demanding her rights, but as a humble servant, trusting in the goodness of her kinsman redeemer. She was effectively saying to Boaz, I respect you, I trust you, I put my life in your hands. In those days, uncovering his feet and lying down there was understood to be the role of a servant, to lay at their master's feet and to be ready for any command of the master. So when Naomi told Ruth to lie down at Boaz's feet, she told her to come to him in a humble, submissive way. Her action was reinforced by her words. Who are you? I am your servant, Ruth. He will tell you what to do. I will do whatever you say. And she did everything her mother-in-law told her to do. Did you notice something here? Ruth does everything Naomi told her to do with one major exception. When Boaz wakes up in the middle of the night and finds a woman next to him, Ruth does not wait to be told what to do by Boaz, but instead tells Boaz what to do. As we saw in chapter 2, Ruth takes the initiative. As we saw in chapter 1, here again we see the mutual love between Ruth and Naomi for each other. In verse 1, Naomi acts in an unselfish manner to achieve what is best for Ruth. Here, if Ruth had let Boaz tell her what to do, Boaz might have proposed marriage, achieving what she desired and fulfilling Naomi's plan, which was for Ruth's welfare and her protection. But instead of letting Boaz tell her what to do, what does Ruth do? She invokes the kinsman redeemer law, thereby ensuring Naomi's land and family line were protected, even if it meant she ended up marrying not Boaz, but the nearer kinsman redeemer. She acts in Naomi's best interests rather than her own. This also demonstrated yet again that Ruth was clean on the inside. In verse 3, Naomi had been concerned with Ruth's outward appearance, but God looks at the heart, and here we again see her selflessness. Remember, the unnamed servant in Genesis 24 was impressed with Rebekah's selflessness. And in Ruth chapter 2, the unnamed servant was again impressed with Ruth's selflessness. And the unnamed servant is a picture for the Holy Spirit. God looks at the heart, not the outward appearance. Naomi said, wash, put on perfume, put on your best clothes. But God looks inside, and Ruth was clean on the inside. The scene. Imagine how fast her pulse was racing when Boaz woke up. Ruth was effectively saying something like, I would like to be the one to whom you pledge your faithfulness and with whom you make a marriage covenant. It was the middle of the night and something had startled the man. Since Boaz had been there to protect against thieves, it must have come as quite a shock to wake up and to realise somebody was there. But his shock quickly turned to wondering when he found out that his visitor was a woman. Boaz had just woken up, and after identifying herself, Ruth said this. There had to have been an immense silence while Boaz considered what she had said and what his response should be. It was midnight. They were under the stars, and he was looking into the face of the woman he loved, covered with his own cloak. To Ruth, waiting for Boaz's response probably felt like an eternity. The Lord bless you. This kindness, hesed. The word hesed appears 248 times in the Bible. It's rendered as kindness, loyalty, love, or faithfulness. It is a full-on, faithfully committed act of love. The word appears 3 times in Ruth. Chapter 1 verse 8, chapter 2 verse 20, and here. Here in verse 10, Boaz is impressed. He had witnessed Ruth's commitment to his relative Naomi. Everything she did was selfless. She was determined to do all she could to ensure Naomi's survival. The hesed she did in verse 10 was done for Naomi, not Boaz, and not for herself. Ruth's hesed in chapters 1 and 3 run parallel to God's act of hesed in chapter 2. In chapter 2 verse 20, Naomi praises God's hesed, saying his hesed has not forsaken the living or the dead. But there's a big difference. The difference between God's hesed and Ruth's hesed is that God's was done despite Naomi's bitterness against him. There was nothing to warrant God's hesed. Have you noticed that every prayer in Ruth is a prayer of blessing, and God answered every one? Naomi asked that God deal kindly, hesed, with Ruth and Orpah in chapter 1 verse 8, the field workers to Boaz in chapter 2 verse 4, Naomi to Boaz in chapter 2 verses 19 to 20. Here, Boaz to Ruth, and later the women to Naomi in chapter 4 verse 14. This kindness is greater than that which you showed earlier. You have not run after the younger men, whether rich or poor. Boaz suggested that other options were open to Ruth. The young men were not kinsman redeemers, and a marriage to one of them would have only benefited Ruth, not Naomi. She could have chosen to marry for love, one of the poorer young men, or for money, one of the richer young men. But instead, she chose a marriage of benefit to Naomi's family. This was a greater kindness to Naomi than the other wonderful things she had done for her mother-in-law. The focus on younger men also emphasises her selflessness, in that Boaz was older, and possibly a lot older than she was. Ruth placed the purpose of providing an heir to her husband Mahlon and her mother-in-law Naomi on the very highest level of priority. Yet it wasn't totally selfless. In chapter 2 verse 20, Ruth learned that Boaz was not the only kinsman redeemer. She did not seek out the other kinsman redeemer. She wanted Boaz. But if the other one was willing to fulfill his duty as the nearer kinsman redeemer, then Ruth was selflessly willing to put Naomi's family needs above her own desires. I want to finish again with this connection with faith. Abraham, the father of faith, lived before the law was given. God's nature abounds in hesed, and I encourage you to look up the scriptures I've got there. The ultimate expression of God's hesed is Jesus. As many as received him, to them he gave the right to become children of God, to those who believe in his name. That passage tells us that Jesus was full of grace. Of his fullness we have all received, and grace for grace. For the law was given through Moses, but grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. By faith, Ruth took refuge under the wings of God. On that night, under the stars, Boaz began his response with words of grace and blessing. Thank you.